The buzzards had been circling for 2 hours by the time Everett Kane spotted the last saguaro cactus disappear over the low ridge. That meant they'd found something, or someone. He didn't let it shake him, not this time. The desert wasn't cruel, it was indifferent, and Everett had learned to treat it the same way. What lay ahead would either break him or make him a legend, and if it broke him, he knew there'd be no one to bury the pieces, just wind and sand, grinding bone into dust. But this story doesn't start with Everett walking into the desert. It starts a week earlier, in the last town before the wasteland began, a place so forgotten it didn't even have a proper name. Folks just called it The Edge. Nothing grew there, nothing stayed. The saloon was built out of warped lumber that had been peeled off failed homesteads, and the water barrel out front had more scorpions than it did drinkable ounces. And yet Everett Kane had shown up there with two things no man in his right mind would carry into that region of the Southwest: a pack with no canteen and a plan nobody believed. He walked into that saloon with the calm of a man who'd already died once and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. Dust on his hat brim, boots scuffed and cracked from weeks of riding, and a strange canvas bundle slung across his back. People noticed the bundle. They always did. It was too long to be a bedroll and too narrow to be a rifle case. The bartender, a man named Reese with a missing ear and a jug of boiled whiskey for a liver, gave him the usual once-over and said, "You lost your water, cowboy?" Everett just nodded once and set a coin on the counter. It wasn't that he didn't drink water, it was that he didn't need to carry it, not anymore. The others laughed. They always did. A young ranch hand even offered him a full canteen, thinking Everett was too proud to ask for help. Everett refused it politely. That boy would be dead in 2 days, his bones curling beneath the sun halfway between the dry creek bed and the place locals called the Breathless Hills. It wasn't arrogance. Everett just knew something they didn't, and he wasn't ready to share it. By that point, whispers had already followed him for over 100 miles. Folks called him the Dry Ghost, or that Mad Desert Man. Rumors ranged from dark to ridiculous, that he'd struck a deal with some Apache spirits, that he'd found an underground river and memorized its path, or that he'd hollowed himself out like a cactus and filled his veins with sand. The truth was stranger and more brutal than any of those tales, because Everett Kane had once nearly died in that desert, once, but instead of dying, he learned. It was 5 years ago, during a cattle drive gone wrong. He'd been hired on as a trail hand with a company out of El Paso moving longhorns through one of the driest patches of the Southwest. Their guide had misjudged the spring. Rains, and by the 3rd day, they were out of water. Men started dying on the 4th. On the 6th day, Everett wandered away from the group looking for anything. Shade, a trickle of moisture, anything. What he found instead was a place he wouldn't name for years. A bowl-shaped ravine lined with rock so hot it pulsed like a furnace, where everything seemed dead, but wasn't. He spent 3 days there. No water, no food, no way out. He should have died, but something happened. He watched the desert, watched how lizards moved, watched what beetles did at dawn, watched how moisture gathered in places that didn't seem to hold it. And slowly, in that fevered, sun-blind state, Everett pieced together something no one had ever told him. The desert gave just enough to survive, but never to spare. You had to know how to ask, and when, and what looked like death sometimes wasn't. He came back different, and nobody trusted him after that. Not entirely. Which brings us back to the edge, to the day Everett announced, without ceremony, that he intended to cross the hollow bone desert without carrying a single drop of water, just the canvas bundle on his back, his revolver, and a few sealed tins of hard biscuit for food. He said he had to get to Perdido, a mining town on the other side of the desert, because someone there owed him a name. No one knew what that meant. They figured he'd lost someone, or planned to find someone. The town laughed again, but when he left at dawn, 5 men followed. They didn't tell him they were going. They just figured they'd catch up, mock him a while, maybe scavenge his gear when he dropped. One of them was a tracker named Brennan, who'd survived Comanche country and once crossed the Pecos on foot. Another was a man who said he used to ride with scouts during the Mexican campaigns. All of them were seasoned. By nightfall of the first day, 2 had turned back. The heat wasn't the worst part. It was the silence. The kind of silence that presses in on the ears until you hear your own blood. No wind, no birds, just the sound of your breath getting shallower, the sand shifting under your boots, and the cruel stretch of land that never ends. And still, Everett pressed on. He didn't drink because he didn't need to, not the way others did. That's what unnerved the last 3 men following him. They rationed their water and watched him, waiting for the moment he'd collapse, or reveal his trick, but it never came. He moved like a man used to heat, to thirst, to deprivation. At night, while they huddled and drank warm mouthfuls of coppery water, Everett dug shallow pits, lined them with some sort of waxed cloth from his bundle, and covered them with netting and dust. In the morning, there'd be water inside. Not much, a few ounces at most, but it was clean, real. One man swore it was magic, another demanded to see how he'd done it. Everett said nothing. He just walked. But it wasn't magic. It was science. It was patience. It was something he'd pieced together from desert creatures, from years of failure, from watching the way condensation formed on rock walls before dawn, and how insects lived beneath the soil in chambers damp enough to support eggs. The waxed cloth wasn't special. It was just treated canvas. The netting was fine enough to let vapor pass but keep dust out. The pit trapped heat during the day, and when the desert cooled at night, condensation formed. Simple, but only if you knew. On the third day, Brennan collapsed. He hadn't paced himself. Everett told him as much. "You're moving like you're fighting the desert. You gotta move like you belong to it." Brennan cursed him, begged for water. Everett gave him a few sips, enough to walk back. If he left then, Brennan did. He didn't make it. Now only one man followed, a young Mexican named Luis, who said he had nothing to go back to. Everett didn't ask why. He didn't need to. Men like Luis carried their pasts like shadows, close enough to haunt, too far to outrun. Luis watched everything Everett did, the way he moved at dawn and dusk, resting during the blazing noon hours in shallow scrapes shaded by stone, the way he collected beetles at sunrise and cracked them for moisture, the way he kept his body wrapped, not exposed, to keep sweat from evaporating too fast, and the way he never seemed afraid. By the fifth day, Luis stopped asking questions. He just copied, and Everett let him, because this wasn't about secrecy anymore. It was about proving a point, that the desert could be crossed, not through conquest, but through submission. That if you humbled yourself, gave up the arrogance of civilization and the illusion of mastery, the land might let you pass. Might. But then came the seventh day, and everything fell apart. Luis was gone. The prince showed he'd wandered off during the night, maybe chasing something in a dream, maybe overcome by the endless heat. Everett found the prince at dawn, circling like a lost animal. Then, nothing. The buzzards appeared hours later, and Everett knew he'd have to make a choice. Go after the boy, risk himself, or continue on and leave the lesson unspoken. And that's where the real story begins. Everett Kane stood at the edge of the boy's tracks, the toe of his boot touching the place where the prince began to stagger and loop. The desert didn't often leave clean stories in the sand, but this one was clear enough. Luis had wandered, whether in sleep or delirium, no one could say, but he'd gone east, not toward the ridgeline Everett had marked the night before, not toward the morning light that signaled their direction, but back, or sideways, or nowhere at all. The prince turned in on themselves like a man trying to escape a dream that wouldn't let go. The buzzards above didn't lie. They never did. Everett took one last drink, not from a canteen, but from the shallow collector he'd set before dawn. 2 mouthfuls, enough to hold. Then he turned and followed the prince. Not because he expected to find Luis alive, not because he thought there was a chance, but because men didn't leave boys behind, not in places like this. It wasn't a code. It was something older, something that felt like a bone-deep refusal to let the desert win completely. The sun had only just broken free of the ridges, but already the heat shimmered like wet glass on the horizon. He moved fast, using his hat to block the glare, his body already wrapped against evaporation. The sand here was different, finer, shifting with each step, filling in the boy's trail. He had maybe an hour before it disappeared entirely. The first thing he found was the boy's scarf, caught in a low mesquite, the edge dark with blood. Not much, a scrape maybe, or a nosebleed from the dry air. It didn't matter. It meant Luis was moving fast, disoriented. 10 minutes later he found the boot, just one, half buried in the sand, a poor sign. Then the body. Luis lay crumpled in the shadow of a rock outcrop, as if he'd crawled there trying to escape the sun. His hands were blistered, lips split and blackened. The boy's canteen was still slung at his side, full. Everett didn't touch it. He knelt beside the body and placed 2 fingers against the neck. A pulse, faint, ragged, but there. Everett didn't allow relief to bloom. Not yet. The desert punished hesitation as brutally as arrogance. He scanned the area, found the highest point, and made a decision. He couldn't carry Luis out, not yet, but he could buy them time. Within minutes, he had the shade net strung across the rock face, pinned with iron spikes he carried in a hidden pouch on his belt. The waxed canvas collector went up next, set shallow with the last of his shaded tools, a bit of dust sprinkled over the top to camouflage it from the wind. Then he moved to Luis. The boy was near the edge, heat stroke, maybe worse. Everett opened the canteen, poured a few drops at a time onto Luis's tongue. Not too much. Too much touch could kill just as fast. He repeated the process every few minutes, watching the boys breathing, feeling for signs. An hour passed. The sun climbed. Then Luis coughed, a ragged, broken sound like a crow's cry. Everett steadied him. "You wandered," he said. "Desert don't like that." Luis blinked once, then grimaced as pain caught up with him. "I saw a woman," he rasped. "In white." Everett nodded slowly. "They all do. Just before dying." Luis tried to sit up. Everett stopped him. "You'll live," he said, "if you stay still. But you—" "I've walked farther on worse," Everett said. "You just learn not to argue with the sun." He left Luis under the canvas shade with instructions not to move, not even to shift his body unless absolutely necessary. Everett left the boy with one of his biscuits, a strip of dried jackrabbit, and half the water from the newly collected basin. Then he turned and walked back the way they'd come, toward the path he had scouted. Perdido was still a day and a half away if the route held, less if he took the cut-glass pass, but that was a gamble. No man had walked through it since the old Spanish days. The canyon was narrow, shaded and cool, but it was also full of dead ends, drop-offs, and the kind of claustrophobic silence that made men mad. He debated the route for hours. Then he remembered what Luis had said about the woman in white. Dreams like that meant the desert was getting inside, not just the skin, but the mind. If they stayed too long, it wouldn't matter how much water Everett could gather or how clever his methods were. Luis would wander again, and next time Everett might not find him. So he chose Cut-Glass Pass. It started as a dry wash at the base of a fractured mesa, narrow, winding, overhung with ancient basalt formations that cast just enough shadow to make the air feel breathable. Everett moved carefully, stepping where the ground told him to, feeling for shifts beneath the sand that might indicate sinkholes or dead pits. He moved like he'd been born there. In some ways he had. Cut-Glass wasn't marked on any map. Only one man had ever told Everett about it, an old Pima guide he'd met after his first desert crossing. The man had been blind in one eye, half mad from sunstroke and missing 3 fingers, but his memory was sharp. He'd drawn the pass in the dirt with a bone, telling Everett that the desert kept secrets the same way it kept bones, buried but not forgotten. Everett had memorized the path, but that had been years ago, and deserts change. The first mile was smooth, too smooth. Everett moved slower, more cautious. Then he saw the bones, not human. Mule, maybe, picked clean, but not by scavengers. The sun had done the work, split the ribs wide open, whitened the skull to a shine, but the way it lay, bent backwards, neck arched, told a story of panic, of something gone wrong. Everett crouched beside the remains, ran his fingers through the dust. Not just heat, collapse, maybe a rockfall, maybe worse. He moved on. The pass narrowed to shoulder width, with walls rising on either side like the throat of some ancient beast. The air was cooler, but heavy. Dead air, no wind, no sound. He pressed forward, another turn, another bend, then voices, faint, distant. He froze. The desert didn't echo, not like this, which meant they were real. He slid along the rock wall, hand on his revolver, ears straining. The voices weren't speaking English, Spanish, maybe Apache, hard to tell. Then laughter. Harsh, sharp, outlaws, smugglers maybe. Cut-Glass was a known haunt for runners who wanted to avoid the patrol trails. If they saw him, he'd have no chance to explain, and Luis wouldn't survive without him. Everett backed up, slow, deliberate. He needed another way through. He scanned. The walls, there, a crevice just wide enough, steep, almost vertical, but climbable. He stowed the revolver, tied his boots with strips of hide, and started climbing. The stone was hot but rough enough to grip. He didn't think, just moved, each foothold a decision, each breath a countdown. By the time he reached the ledge, his fingers were raw and his arms shaking, but he was above the voices now, above the pass, above the danger, and there, ahead, the ridge, the last one before Perdido. He could see it. He stayed low, crossed the top of the mesa, and didn't stop until the sun was dipping low. He found a place to rest, a shallow alcove with a view of the valley. Then he waited. At dusk, the wind picked up, cooler now, smelling of iron and stone. He set the last of his cloths, gathered 2 more ounces of water, and ate the final strip of jackrabbit. Tomorrow, he'd return for Luis. But tonight, he slept, because the final test was coming, and the desert wasn't done yet. Everett Kane did not sleep long. Sometime in the deepest part of night, when the heat finally slipped away, and the desert's silence sharpened to a blade's edge, he opened his eyes. Something had changed. He couldn't say what exactly. There was no noise, no shift in the wind, just that subtle, skin-deep prickle that every seasoned frontiersman learns to trust, the one that whispers a warning before your brain can name the danger. He moved without sound, rolling from his sleeping alcove to crouch low behind a stone ledge, one hand on the revolver. The moon had risen but offered little light in cut-glass pass. The fractured spires above him threw shadows in every direction, tricking the eye. He waited, heart steady, muscles coiled, listening. Then he saw it. Movement, slow, deliberate, no more than 30 feet down slope near the lip of the mesa. Not an animal, too upright. A man, maybe two. Silhouettes drifting between the rocks, pausing, scanning. Scouts. They were looking for something, or someone. And Everett knew damn well who that someone was. He'd been spotted, or at least suspected. Maybe they'd found his trail climbing the rock face. Maybe one of the smugglers down in the pass had caught a glimpse of his boot print and passed word up the line. Either way, he couldn't stay here. He considered his options. Turning back toward Luis wasn't possible. Not now. He needed a different route, a high route, one that would let him circle back unseen. To the north, the mesa sloped into a series of broken ridgelines, shattered remnants of ancient volcanic upheaval, dangerous ground, loose rock, sudden drops, no clear trails. But it was the only way. Everett moved fast and low, taking care to disturb as little dust as possible. His canvas bundle stayed strapped tight against his back, its weight a comfort rather than a burden. Every tool inside had a purpose. Every scrap of cloth and waxed leather had been tested in harsher places than this. He had no water, but he didn't need it yet. His system worked, just enough moisture to keep his body functioning, just enough energy stored in muscle memory and careful breath control to carry him farther than most would believe. As he slipped into the boulder fields beyond the ridge, Everett let his mind quiet. He moved like a shadow, boots finding silent purchase on stone, body folded into the terrain. Years of living with the desert, not in defiance of it, but in harmony, had taught him how to vanish. Behind him, voices rose, Spanish again, mixed with English now. He saw him climbing. Maybe a scout. Orders are to bring him in. Everett didn't wait to hear more. By dawn, he was 3 miles east, perched above a narrow gully that overlooked the trail he'd marked 2 days earlier, the one he and Luis had followed before the boy's disappearance. He could see the faint markers he'd left, a cairn built like a triangle, a cluster of dried yucca tied with cord, and beyond them, the telltale pattern in the dust that meant his collectors had been working overnight. If Luis had stayed put, there'd be water waiting. Everett made his descent slow and cautious, not because he feared falling, but because something in the air felt wrong, too still, too expectant. He reached the basin just after first light. Luis was gone, not vanished. The boy had moved, but gone from the shaded pit Everett had constructed. The canvas lay undisturbed, water still pooled in the collector's basin, a biscuit untouched beside it. But the boy's bedroll had been folded. His tracks led away, not far, northward, toward the line of black rock Everett had told him to avoid. Everett cursed under his breath. It wasn't a long trail, less than a quarter mile, but it led to the one place he hadn't wanted to approach again, the Alabaster Hollows. The name didn't come from any map. It was something locals whispered, a reference to the bone-colored stone that jutted from the earth like fossilized fangs. The place had a reputation, not supernatural, not quite, but known among old-timers as a dead zone. Compass needles spun in circles there. Water collectors failed. Animals avoided it. And men who slept there spoke of dreams that didn't feel like dreams. Everett had passed through it once, years ago. He had no desire to do so again. But Luis was out there. He followed the tracks. They wavered, not in a wandering pattern, but in steps too precise, too intentional. Like Luis had been drawn rather than walked. Everett found a strip of cloth caught on a jagged stone, part of the boy's sleeve, and then a tin cup, placed deliberately on a flat rock, as if marking the way. Then he found the fire ring, small, recent, still warm, and Luis, sitting cross-legged in the center, eyes wide, staring into the empty coals. Everett approached carefully. "You left the shade," he said, crouching beside him. "Told you not to." Luis didn't move. "I wasn't alone," he said. His voice was calm, too calm. Everett looked around. Nothing but stone and sky. "Who was with you?" he asked. Luis blinked slowly. "She said I wasn't meant to die. Not here. Said I needed to go back with you." Everett felt the hairs rise on his neck, not from fear, from memory. What did she look like? Luis tilted his head. "Pale, like the rocks. Long hair. No shoes." Everett had seen her once too. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he reached out and placed a hand on Luis's shoulder. "She shows up when the desert decides to let someone live," he said. "Or maybe when it changes its mind about killing them." Luis turned to him, finally. "Why are you helping me?" Everett didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Because someone helped me once, and because no one should cross this place alone." They left the hollows by midday. The sun was high, but a wind had picked up. Strange for this region. It cooled them slightly, carried dust eastward, obscuring their tracks. Everett didn't trust it. The desert didn't offer gifts without consequence. By evening, they reached the final ridge before Perdido. Below them, in the fading light, The town shimmered like a mirage, a cluster of tin roofs, dusty streets, and the black gash of a mine cut into the hillside. Luis collapsed beside a rock. "We made it," he whispered. Everett looked down at the town, his face unreadable. "No," he said, "not yet, because what waited in Perdido wasn't water or shelter. It was the reason he'd crossed this hell in the first place. A name, a man, a reckoning, and the desert had been the easy part." The descent into Perdido began just after dusk, with the last threads of twilight bleeding out across the rim of the desert like smoke from a dying fire. Luis slept curled beneath a rock overhang, his breath shallow but steady. Everett Kane stood watch above, eyes locked on the flickering lights of the mining town below, the fingers of one hand resting loosely on the butt of his revolver. He hadn't seen Perdido in 8 years. From this distance, it looked unchanged. The same crooked line of shanty buildings sagging against the valley wall, the same glow of oil lamps leaking through warped shutters, the same narrow streets traced into the dirt like veins in dried skin. But Everett knew better. Places like Perdido didn't stay the same because they were timeless. They stayed the same because no one lived long enough to change them. And somewhere in that town was a man named Calder Boone. That name had ridden in Everett's mind for too many years, not as a memory, but as a wound that refused to scar. Boone was the reason Everett had once bled out in the sand, the reason he'd wandered 3 days alone with a bullet in his shoulder and the sun peeling strips of skin from his face like bark off driftwood, the reason he had learned to survive without water, because water hadn't been there when he needed it, and no man came looking. Boone had left him to die, and that kind of betrayal leaves a shape behind. The next morning, Everett woke Luis before first light. The boy stirred slowly, groaning against the stiffness in his limbs, blinking at the sudden chill that clung to the pre-dawn air like a shroud. "Where are we?" he mumbled. "Close," Everett said. "But you stay here. I go in alone." Luis sat up. "Why, after all that?" "Because there's a man in that town who needs to see me walk out of the desert," Everett said, voice low and firm. "Alone. If I bring someone with me, it changes the story." Luis frowned, confused. "What story?" "The one he's been telling himself for years." Before Luis could argue, Everett stood and unslung the canvas bundle from his back. Inside was more than just tools and treated cloth. There were tokens, items he hadn't touched in years. He opened the roll and removed a single object. A rusted spur, snapped in half, the metal blackened and twisted at one end like it had been scorched in a fire. He held it in his hand for a moment, thumb running across the jagged edge. Then he turned and walked toward Perdido. He didn't take the main trail down, too exposed. Instead, he circled westward, weaving through dry washes and shallow arroyos, moving with the kind of silence that only comes from years of walking among things that kill by hearing your heartbeat. He passed a pair of mule skeletons, their tack still intact, leather brittle as paper, past a half-buried wagon wheel, scorched and split. The desert was always swallowing things. That's how it kept its secrets. By the time he reached the edge of town, the sun was crawling up behind the hills, and the streets of Perdido were beginning to wake. A woman swept dust from a porch with a bundle of sage tied in twine. 2 boys chased a mangy dog past a collapsed fence. A prospector leaned against a post, eyes shaded beneath a brim stiff with salt and grime. No one recognized Everett. He looked different now, leaner, darker, the lines around his mouth carved deep by sun and silence. But even if someone had remembered the name, they wouldn't have dared speak it. Not here, not with Boone still running things. Everett headed straight for the saloon. It had once been called the Gold Fang. Now the sign simply read saloon, the rest burned away by time or gunpowder. Inside, it smelled of whiskey, sweat, and the kind of old dust that never quite settles. A piano stood silent in the corner, half the keys missing. 3 men played cards at a table near the window. A woman sat behind the bar, drying glasses that hadn't seen water in weeks. Everett walked in like he belonged there, because once he had. The bartender didn't look up. "Ain't open for your kind till noon." Everett kept walking. "Hey," the woman snapped, slamming a glass down. "I said." He stopped at the bar, reached into his coat, and placed the broken spur on the wood between them. The woman froze. Her face changed. Not recognition, but fear, slow and creeping. She stared at the spur like it was a snake coiled to strike. Everett met her eyes. "Is he still here?" he asked. She didn't speak. He waited. Then finally she nodded, once, toward the stairs. "Room at the end," she said, voice brittle. "Been there 3 days?" Everett left the spur on the bar and moved toward the staircase. Every eye in the saloon followed him. The silence was a storm waiting to break. Upstairs, the hallway creaked beneath his boots. The last door on the right stood closed. Light leaked from beneath it. He knocked once. A pause. Then, "Yeah?" He opened the door. Calder Boone looked up from a table covered in maps and half-empty bottles. He'd aged, hair thinner, face gone to fat, but the eyes were the same, pale, calculating, hollow. At first he didn't recognize Everett, then he did, and the color drained from his face. Kane. Everett stepped inside, closed the door behind him. Boone stood slowly, one hand drifting toward the revolver on the table. Everett shook his head. "Don't," he said. "Not yet." Boone licked his lips. "You're dead." "Not quite. No one crosses that desert, not without water, not alive." Everett took another step forward. "I did," he said, "and I brought something back." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded square of waxed canvas, set it on the table. Then he sat. Boone didn't move. "You left me," Everett said, voice even. "Wounded, no food, no water." Boone opened his mouth, closed it. "I was shot," Everett continued. "Ambush. You panicked, rode off, told the others I was dead. I thought, you didn't think, you just ran." Boone's hand shook as he reached for the bottle, poured a shot, missed the glass. Everett didn't flinch. "I made it out," he said. "Learned things. About the desert. About thirst. About how long a man can last if he listens instead of fights." He leaned forward. "I'm not here to kill you, Boone." Boone looked up, confused. "Then why?" "I want your claim." That stopped him cold. "What? You've got rights to the East Mine. I want them." Boone laughed, harsh, disbelieving. "You crossed hell to ask for my mining rights?" "No," Everett said. "I crossed hell to prove I could. Now I'm asking, because that mine's on land I buried a friend, and I won't have you digging it up for silver." Boone stared. Then slowly, he nodded. "Take it," he said. "It ain't worth what they say anyway. Shaft's half collapsed." Everett stood. "That's not why I want it." Boone didn't ask. "Because some debts can't be paid with bullets. Some must be paid by taking back what should never have been taken in the first place." Everett left the saloon an hour later, the deed in hand. Outside, Luis was waiting. "You done?" he asked. Everett nodded. "Then let's get out of here." They walked eastward, away from Perdido, away from the town that had once buried a part of Everett Kane beneath its lies. He'd crossed the desert without water, but what he really carried through the sand was memory. And now, at last, it was done. They left Perdido before the sun was fully over the hills, moving in silence, with the weight of unfinished business lifting slowly off Everett Kane's shoulders, like the dust that trailed behind each bootfall. The town didn't watch them go. Perdido never did. It had a way of forgetting things quickly, the way sand swallows footprints or wind erases names carved in wood. A place like that never held on to anything. Not guilt, not truth, and certainly not men like Everett. Luis walked beside him now, stronger than he had any right to be after days in the desert. He carried a small satchel filled with supplies Everett had bartered for: cured meat, dried beans, an old but sturdy compass, and 2 sheets of canvas that would serve as collectors. Luis had asked no questions about what happened inside the saloon, and Everett hadn't volunteered answers. Some things lost their shape when spoken aloud. They traveled northeast, skirting the old silver ridge, toward the rim of the high desert where the wind moved strange and the land looked like it had been punched by the fist of God. Ridges collapsed into bowls, stone twisted into spirals, canyons that split open without warning like wounds beneath thin skin. It was a longer route back, but safer than retracing the path through Cutglass Pass or the Alabaster Hollows. At least, that was the plan. By midday, the heat returned with a vengeance, pressing down from above while rising from below, a cruel 2-pronged assault that left most men dazed and staggering by early afternoon. But Everett was already adjusting their pace, slowing to conserve sweat, wrapping exposed skin in strips of light-colored cloth, and teaching Luis how to breathe through his nose and exhale through tight lips to reduce moisture loss. They walked in shade where possible, beneath rock ledges or along the long shadows of desert junipers. Everett showed Luis how to choose rest spots, not just by temperature, but by airflow. A slight breeze through a crack in the canyon wall could make the difference between rest and delirium. He taught the boy how to listen to the wind, how to read the behavior of ants and beetles for signs of nearby moisture, how to press his hand against the inside of shaded stones to feel for condensation, how to build a pit collector properly and position it where the sun would heat it just enough by day and let it breathe by night. Luis listened. He didn't just nod, he absorbed, and that gave Everett hope. But as they moved deeper into the fractured plateau, Everett noticed something troubling. The land was changing in ways it shouldn't. Rock formations that had once stood as fixed markers were gone, collapsed into rubble. A dry creek bed, he remembered, was now split in 2, severed by a recent landslide. Dust clouds rose from places where no wind blew, and there were bones, not old, sun-whitened remains, but fresh ones, bleached but not scattered, laid out, arranged. He found the first set beneath an overhang, a mule, ribs cracked, neck twisted, no scavenger damage, just still. The second set came 2 hours later, a coyote, paws curled beneath it like it had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. Luis noticed it too. "Something wrong with this place?" he asked. Everett didn't answer right away. Then, "It remembers," Luis frowned. "What?" "The desert. It remembers what we bring into it. Blood, anger, regret. You walk through it full of hate, and it marks the path behind you." Luis looked over his shoulder, as if expecting to see the ground rising up. "You think it's watching us?" "No," Everett said. "I think it's waiting." That night they camped on the leeward side of a rock shelf, shielded from the wind. Everett built no fire. There was no need. They had warm rock to rest against, and enough dry food to last another 3 days. Instead, he used the night to teach Luis how to read the stars. "You see that cluster?" he said, pointing to a tight group of blue-white lights above the northern rim. "Looks like a fishhook." "Yeah, that's the liar's teeth. You follow those too long and they'll pull you in circles. But see that faint trail leading off to the left, like smoke?" Luis squinted. "Yeah, that's the breath line. Always points to the nearest water." "Seriously?" Everett smiled. "No, but it keeps your mind focused, makes you look for patterns. That's what matters." Luis laughed, a low, tired sound. But that night, Everett didn't sleep. He sat with his back against the stone, revolver across his lap, eyes scanning the darkness for movement. And in the hour before dawn, he saw it, a figure, barely visible, standing at the edge of the gully below, not approaching, just watching. He stood slowly, careful not to wake Luis. The figure didn't move. He stepped forward, hand tightening on the revolver. But when he reached the edge, the figure was gone. No prints, no trail, just wind-blown dust. He didn't wake Luis. There was no point. Come morning, they packed up and moved on. But Everett couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone anymore. By the 3rd day of return travel, their collectors were producing less. The wind had shifted again, this time bringing heat that didn't fade at night. The pits yielded barely 2 ounces. Everett compensated by slowing their movement further, resting longer in shaded gaps, and chewing on cactus pulp to keep their mouths from drying. Then, late that afternoon, they found the wagon, half buried in a dry wash. It had clearly overturned during a descent. The front wheels were shattered, the axle split. There were signs of struggle, gouges in the dust, scattered crates, footprints, and blood. Luis looked to Everett. "What happened?" Everett knelt beside a broken crate, found a strip of fabric, striped, faded, Mexican weave. He stood, scanning the distance. Then he saw it, vultures, circling. They followed the trail. Less than a mile up the ridge, they found 3 bodies. 1 man, 1 woman, and a child. All sunstruck. No water, no supplies. Just cracked lips and open eyes staring at a sky that had given them nothing. Luis looked away, jaw tight. "We bury them?" he asked. Everett nodded. They dug shallow graves, marked them with stones, and left the man's pistol, rusted, empty, placed upright in the dirt, barrel to the heavens. Luis didn't speak for hours afterward. They moved on in silence. That night the wind carried sound, faint, distant. Drums, not real drums, not the kind you could find and touch, but the rhythm was unmistakable. A low, pulsing thump that came from the earth, not the air. Everett felt it through his boots, not his ears. He said nothing. Luis heard it too. "You hear that?" he asked. Everett just nodded. "What is it?" "A reminder." "Of what?" "That you don't walk out of the desert clean." They camped that night in the cradle of a dry ravine. No fire, no talking. And as Everett closed his eyes, the sound of the drums faded. But the dreams did not. He dreamed of the woman in white, the one Luis had seen in the hollows. She stood on a ridge, her face obscured by her hair, pointing towards something Everett couldn't see. Her hand was bleeding. The sky behind her burned like sunset. And when he reached her, she vanished. He woke with sweat clinging to his skin, and the sound of breath that wasn't his. He turned, but Luis was still asleep, alone. Dawn broke like a knife sliding beneath old scars. Quietly at first, then all at once. The desert didn't rise with birdsong or morning dew. It creaked and cracked and whispered as the sun crawled over the rim of the eastern mesa and began pressing its heat into everything it touched. Everett Kane stood already awake, boots laced, pack rolled tight, scanning the southern ridge where shadows still clung like regrets. Luis stirred behind him, groaning softly as he pushed himself upright, his face gaunt and eyes still fogged from sleep. "I dreamt of her again," he muttered, voice hoarse. "The woman in white." Everett didn't answer. He didn't have to. Luis had begun seeing things Everett hadn't spoken aloud. That meant something, not supernatural. Everett had stopped believing in omens after his second winter half dead and hallucinating beneath a cactus, but significant. The desert didn't give visions, it gave reflections. It showed you what you already carried, what you buried deep. And if Luis was dreaming of the woman again, it meant his fear was no longer just about dying out here. It was about what he might become if he survived. They packed in silence, and set out northeast, climbing steadily through a series of stone shelves that once marked the outer edge of a long-dried river system. Everett knew this place. He'd crossed it once with a survey crew years ago, back when he still took money to guide greenhorns through wasteland, back before Perdido, back before Boone. But even here, the land had shifted. Where once there had been a line of wind-carved markers, standing stones like fingers pointing at the sky, now there was only rubble, a collapse, or sabotage. Either way, the old trail was gone. They pressed forward regardless. By midday, the heat was rising off the stone in waves, warping the horizon into a molten smear. Luis moved slowly but deliberately, his steps no longer tentative. He had begun to match Everett's rhythm without thinking, adjusting his gait, limiting his sweat, watching for shade before thirst. The desert was no longer punishing him, it was teaching. But Everett's focus wasn't on the terrain. It was on the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't visible, it wasn't audible, but it pressed against the edge of his instincts like an old ache in bone before a storm, and he had learned long ago not to ignore those aches. They reached a high plateau in late afternoon, a flat stretch of quartz and shale that shimmered like ice under the sun, and Everett stopped short. Luis nearly walked past him. "What is it?" Everett didn't speak. He knelt slowly, fingers tracing the surface of the rock. A shoe print, not his, not Luis's, fresh, not more than a few hours old. He scanned the plateau. More tracks, faint, scattered. Then a boot heel, dragging, deep, followed by a handprint in the dust. Someone had come this way, someone injured. Luis followed his gaze. "Could be one of the smugglers?" Everett shook his head. "Too far east. They don't range out this way. No water, no cover." "Then who?" Everett didn't answer, because he already knew. They followed the trail. It was difficult at first. The stone didn't hold prints well, but the wounded always left a trail eventually. After a mile, they found a bloody rag tied to a mesquite branch, then a strip of torn cloth, then the smell, old blood, flies, death, but not a body. Instead, they found a man slumped against the base of a rock, alive, barely, skin blistered, eyes sunblind, lips split like dried clay. He was mumbling something incoherent, a string of words looping again and again. Everett approached slowly. The man didn't move. Only when Everett knelt beside him did he recognize the face. It was one of Boone's men, the same who had been sitting at the saloon card table days earlier. Broad-shouldered, tattooed forearm, scar across his cheek like a canyon slash. Everett pressed a hand to his neck, pulse shallow. The man's eyes fluttered. Recognition flared. "You," Everett said nothing. "Boone said you, witch tricks. No man lives." Then he convulsed. Luis rushed forward. "Is he dying?" Everett didn't look away. "He's already dead. He just hasn't stopped breathing yet." The man gurgled, and then stillness. A minute passed, then another. Luis stood. "Why would Boone send someone after you? You already took the deed." Everett didn't answer right away. He reached into the man's satchel, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, stained, half torn. It was a map, their route, marked in red ink. Luis leaned over. "He planned this." Everett's jaw tightened. "He never meant for me to leave Perdido. The deed was just theater. He figured if he let me walk, I'd never make it out. But if I did, he'd send someone to finish it." Everett folded the map. "Boone doesn't like loose ends." Luis stared at the corpse. "So now what?" Everett looked east. "We changed the route." They moved quickly, descending from the plateau into a narrow series of box canyons that snaked east like veins toward the high flats of Turquoise Ridge. A brutal climb, but safer than the direct pass. No one would expect Everett to take it. It added 2 days, but with enough shade and careful timing, they could make it. They climbed until dusk. At the ridge crest, they camped again, this time with a fire. Small, smokeless, tucked into a hollow, because Everett wanted any pursuers to think they were headed south. That night, Luis sat beside the flames, hands open to the warmth. He was quieter than usual. "You ever think," he said finally, "that surviving out here makes you something different?" Everett didn't answer immediately. Luis continued. "I mean, the things you know, the way you move, how you drink from cactus and catch water from air, how you don't drink when you're thirsty. Most men can't live like that." Everett nodded slowly. "Most men die." Luis looked into the fire. "Then maybe it's not living, just not dying." The flames crackled. Everett stared into them, remembering that first time, years ago, when he'd lain broken beneath a stone arch with no water, no food, no hope, and learned the rules not from men but from the land itself. He hadn't chosen to become what he was. The desert had chosen, and it didn't make saints. It made survivors. The next morning, they broke camp and began the descent from Turquoise Ridge. Everett estimated they were 3 days from the next known spring, a narrow trickle that bled from the side of a basalt cliff deep in the southern basin. If it still ran, the last time he'd seen it, the water was just enough to fill a boot and taste like rust. But it was real. That was enough. But before noon, the wind changed. changed. It came hard from the north, a dry blast carrying dust and heat and something heavier. Smoke, not campfire smoke, wildfire. Everett stopped mid-step. Luis caught up. "What is it?" Everett raised his hand, tasted the air. "Someone lit a burn." Luis's eyes widened. "To flush us out? Or kill us?" They reached the ridge crest and saw it, a thin column of black rising from the southwest. Controlled, precise, not wildfire. Set fire, a ring, closing. Everett's mind raced. If Boone had sent more men and they knew enough to light a burn, they weren't just hunting, they were herding, cutting off options, using the land as a weapon. "Come on," he said. "We need altitude." They climbed again, skirting the edge of a sandstone wall, following a game trail Everett remembered from years back. It was steep, narrow, and barely wide enough for footing, but it climbed fast, away from the smoke. By late afternoon, they reached a ledge high above the burn zone. From there, Everett could see the pattern. Multiple small fires set to converge in the basin below. A funnel. Anyone down there would have nowhere to go. Luis exhaled slowly. "That would have been us." Everett said nothing. Then he pointed east. "There. See that notch in the hills?" Luis nodded. "That's our new road." And what lay beyond it was the final stretch. But Everett knew it would not come easy, because the desert didn't just test the body, it tested what you carried inside. The notch Everett Kane had pointed out wasn't on any map, nor was it spoken of in trail circles. It had no name, no markers, no history anyone remembered aloud, but Everett had passed through it once, and once was enough. The place was like a wound in the earth, narrow, crooked, and deep, a scar between two shoulders of rock that bled shadow even at high noon. The locals, if they spoke of it at all, called it the Split, and those who tried to use it rarely came back with the same eyes. Luis followed Everett up the crumbling trail that led to the mouth of the Split, legs shaking, breath short, but no longer asking questions. He had stopped asking things days ago. There was a look to him now, the look of someone who had seen too much sun, too little water, and something else, a thin flame of resolve that no longer needed explanation. He was no longer the boy Everett had found curled in the shade, half dead and dreaming of women in white. He was something harder now, not finished, but forged. They reached the top by mid-morning, the sun beginning to press its weight onto the stone behind them, making every surface hot to the touch. The Split yawned open like a throat ahead, its stone walls blotting out the sun with a kind of malicious geometry that made the air colder inside than out. Wind whistled through it, not strong but sharp. It carried a tone that made Everett's jaw clench without meaning to. Luis paused at the edge. "Feels wrong." "It is," Everett said. "Then why are we going in?" "Because it's the only way they won't follow." Luis looked back, down the slope toward the basin they'd just escaped. The fires had burned out in the night, but their scar still stained the land, black streaks against yellow and red earth. The smoke had cleared, but something about the quiet behind them was unnatural. Everett had seen men lay traps like that before, burn the trail, wait for the smoke to die, then hunt what flees with cooled eyes and steady hands. The Split, for all its danger, gave cover, and sometimes cover was the only thing that mattered. They stepped inside. Immediately, the temperature dropped, not by much, 5, maybe 10 degrees, but enough to feel like stepping out of a furnace into the belly of something deeper. The walls closed in quickly, 10 feet wide at first, then 7, then 5. The floor was uneven, all broken shale and toothy rock. Overhead, the sky disappeared entirely. The light took on a blue cast, and the wind, now trapped between stone, grew teeth. For 2 hours, they moved single file. Everett in front, Luis behind, boots scraping against the cold floor, every step sending echoes that bounced strangely. Some sounds returned wrong, distorted, too slow, or too fast. Once, Luis turned suddenly, thinking he'd heard a voice behind them. Nothing. Then he heard it again, a woman's voice, whispering his name. He didn't mention it. Everett had told him once, early on. "The desert repeats what it hears. Don't listen too long." At the time, Luis had thought it poetic. Now he knew better. They stopped beneath a jagged overhang where water had once dripped. Everett could still see the mineral stains on the rock, and made camp. It wasn't much, a few mouthfuls of dried meat, a half-ounce of water collected from their last basin, and silence. Everett didn't light a fire. Not here, not in the Split. Heat didn't behave right in narrow places. Flames could throw shadows where there shouldn't be any. As dusk settled, or what passed for dusk beneath so much rock, Everett sat across from Luis and unwrapped a small bundle from his canvas roll. Inside was a folded scrap of leather, a journal. Luis blinked. "You write?" "No," Everett said. "I record." "Same thing." "No," he said again. "Writing is for remembering. Recording is so I don't forget." Luis tilted his head. "That's the same thing." Everett didn't smile. "You'll understand one day." He opened the leather cover and scanned the last few entries. Most were rough sketches, collector layouts, notes on airflow and temperature, water yield versus soil composition. But interspersed were fragments of thoughts, a sentence here, a half-finished reflection there, found moisture beneath shaded basalt, 1.3 Oz over 6 hours. Do not trust shade after midday. Boone lied. The mine was never real. She walked between stones again last night. White dress, no prints. Luis leaned closer. Is that her? The woman you see? Everett didn't look up. She's not real. Then why record it? Because something made her. Luis didn't argue. He sat back, eyes distant. The journal went away. The silence settled in again. Then, deep in the split, something changed. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a vibration, like a low hum traveling through stone. Everett felt it in his ribs, not his ears. He stood slowly. Luis did the same, staring down the path ahead. The hum grew, a rhythmic tremor, and then, at last, a sound. Stone scraping stone. Something large. Everett grabbed Luis's shoulder. Move! They ran. The split didn't echo now. It roared. Behind them, the noise swelled into a cacophony of shifting rock and wind screaming through narrow gaps. The passage was collapsing, or something inside it was moving. Neither option boded well. They ran blindly, trusting Everett's memory of the route. The floor dipped and rose. The walls scraped their shoulders. The light vanished entirely. At one point, Luis stumbled. Everett caught him, hauled him up with a grunt, and kept going. His heart was a drum in his chest, but not from fear, from calculation. Every second counted, every breath. If they missed the turn, the one veering left at the cairn of stacked black stones, they'd be lost in a side shaft that ended in a 20-foot drop. Then there, the stones, still standing. They turned hard left. The sound behind them peaked, a shriek of pressure and release, like a cave exhaling after centuries. Then silence. The passage opened suddenly, as if spatting them out, and they tumbled into a broad, sunlit bowl of stone at the base of a high cliff. The sky reappeared, too bright to look at directly. They lay panting in the dust, bodies trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. Luis rolled onto his side, laughing, short, breathless bursts that sounded more like crying. "We're alive," he gasped. "God, we're alive." Everett sat up, eyes scanning the rim of the canyon. "Don't thank God yet," he muttered, because the real test hadn't come, not yet. They camped again that night under a small rock shelf near the canyon wall. No fire, no words, just the sound of stone cooling and the faintest trickle of water seeping from a crack in the rock. Not enough to drink, but enough to know that something lived beneath this place. Everett collected it carefully with a patch of waxed cloth, channeling every drop into the basin he'd dug with his boot heel. By morning it might be enough to share. Luis was asleep almost instantly, curled tight, like an animal that didn't trust the quiet. Everett stayed awake, and sometime after midnight, he saw her again, the woman in white. She stood on the far rim, above the split, pale, motionless, staring down. Her dress did not move, though the wind pulled at the stone. Her hair hung over her face. Everett didn't blink. She raised one hand, slowly, and pointed east. Then she vanished. He didn't wake Luis, not yet. At dawn they packed and moved. The eastern route was the most dangerous, a dried riverbed flanked by unstable shale slopes that could give way with a single misstep. But Everett had followed that same direction years ago, when he'd first crawled out of the desert half dead and burning. It was the direction that had let him live. They reached the mouth of the wash by mid-morning, the sun already pressing hard. The collectors, set the night before, had yielded barely 2 ounces. Luis drank his share and said nothing. Everett sipped his, then stood. "One more day," he said. "Maybe 2. Luis nodded. They descended into the wash. The walls narrowed quickly. The path meandered. At one point they passed a skeleton, human likely, wedged between 2 boulders, its skull still intact, mouth open as if screaming. Luis looked away. Everett didn't. By mid-afternoon, the heat grew unbearable. The canyon walls reflected the sun down like a funnel of fire. They wrapped themselves in every scrap of canvas they had. Even so, Everett could feel his skin cooking beneath. Then at last, the scent, a breeze, faint but real, carrying the smell of wetness, green, and something else. Smoke, not fire smoke, campfire. They froze. Everett crouched, scanning the canyon ahead. A bend, a flicker of light, voices. He motioned to Luis. They moved forward, slow, silent. And as they rounded the bend, they saw them. 3 men, 2 rifles, 1 fire. One of them wearing Boone's brand. Waiting. The fire was modest, no more than a tight circle of heat ringed by black rock, with one flame licking upward like it was trying not to be noticed. The 3 men around it weren't speaking, not anymore. They had been, Everett Kane could tell from the way one still leaned forward, his mouth frozen mid-word. But something in their bones had felt the disturbance, the shift in wind, the quiet footfall that didn't belong. And now they were still, listening. Everett and Luis crouched behind a boulder no more than 20 yards away, hidden in the curve of the wash where the slope bent like a rib cage. From here, Everett could see the rifles, lever actions, one cradled loose across a man's lap, the other propped casually against a stone. The third man, the one wearing Boone's old trail coat, had no weapon in hand, but that meant nothing. The man himself was the danger. Luis whispered, "Is that—" "Yeah," Everett said. "Boone's dog." The man's name was Paxton. Everett remembered him from the old days. Tall, expressionless. A quiet hound who followed orders to the letter and never questioned where the trail led so long as it ended in someone else's blood. He'd been the one who carried Boone's threats. The one who never showed his teeth unless they were about to bite. Everett had last seen him in El Paso, years back, leaning against a hitch rail as two other men beat a trader for failing to pay Boone his cut. Paxton hadn't lifted a hand. He just watched. Now he was here, waiting. Everett lowered his voice. "We don't run. We don't shout. We walk in." Luis stared at him. "What? They're not here to shoot us. Not right away." Luis's face tightened. "How do you know?" "Because they could have killed us in the split. They didn't, which means they want something." Luis didn't move. "And if you're wrong?" Everett's hand drifted to his revolver. "Then they die fast." Before Luis could speak again, Everett stood and walked forward. Luis hesitated, then followed. The crunch of their boots on the gravel carried louder than Everett expected. The men at the fire turned, slowly, like they already knew who was coming. Paxton stood. The other two followed. None reached for their weapons. Yet, Everett stopped 10 paces from the fire. Luis stood just behind his right shoulder. Paxton gave a tight nod. "Kane, Paxton, you weren't supposed to make it this far." Everett's face stayed still. "No one told the desert." A flicker of a smile, then gone. Paxton glanced at Luis. "Didn't know you had company. Picked him up on the trail." Paxton grunted. "He ain't armed." Everett shook his head. "Doesn't need to be." One of the other men, younger, lean, nervous, shifted his weight. "Boone says—" Everett raised a hand. "Boone's done talking," he said. "He had his chance. This is the end of it." Paxton didn't react. He stared at Everett for a long moment, eyes narrowing. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in oilskin, tossed it to the ground. It landed with a flat thud. Everett didn't move. Paxton said, "He thought you'd turn back when you saw Perdido. Thought the memory'd break you. Didn't expect you'd walk back out." "I didn't come for vengeance," Everett said. "No. You came for land. I came for silence." Paxton nodded. "Boone's gone." Everett's brow lifted just slightly. "Gone? Left Perdido 3 days ago, rode west, took the deed and burned the office?" Everett didn't speak. His hands stayed loose at his sides. Luis didn't even blink. Paxton continued. "We were supposed to catch you before the split. Set a ring of fire. You avoided it. You lit the basin," Everett said. "Yeah, but you climbed." "I remember that canyon from the first time." Paxton tilted his head. "You're not the same man." "No," Everett said. "That man died in the ravine. I just learned to walk with his boots." Silence stretched. Then Everett stepped forward and knelt, unwrapped the oilskin. Inside was a pouch, soft leather, and a folded note. The pouch held silver dust. The note held a name, not Boone's, another. Everett read it once, then folded it and placed it back. Luis whispered, "What does it mean?" "It means the game's not over," Everett said. Paxton watched him. "You leaving the desert?" "No," Everett said. "I'm going deeper." He stood, and something in the air changed. The younger man twitched, reached for his rifle. Too late. Everett's revolver was in his hand before the first click of metal. A single shot rang out, flat, echoing, final. The younger man dropped. Luis flinched. The third man reached for his gun. Everett didn't wait. A second shot cracked through the canyon. The man folded. 2 heartbeats, 2 bodies. Paxton didn't move. Everett lowered the revolver. "I told you, it ends here." Paxton didn't reach for his weapon. He raised both hands, slow. "I'm not your enemy." "No," Everett said. "But you're not my friend." Paxton nodded. "I'll leave. You'll disappear." "Yes, if I hear your name again." "You won't." Everett holstered the revolver. Paxton stepped back, turned, and walked into the shadows of the wash without another word. Luis exhaled, shaky. Everett looked at the bodies. "Bury them." Luis blinked. "What?" "They were following orders. Doesn't make them right. Doesn't make them nothing." Luis moved without arguing. They buried the dead beneath a stack of shale and stone, marking the graves with no names, just silence. Then they moved on. By the next evening, they reached the rim of the final rise, the point where the desert opened into the long, slow plains that led toward the Colorado line. Grass began here, sparse, but real. Birds moved in the distance. The sky no longer felt like a lid. Luis dropped to his knees, staring at the green. Everett didn't stop. He walked to a small rise where the wind rolled off the highland like breath. There he unpacked the final collector, set it gently on the earth, not for water, but for memory. He took out the journal, scrawled a single line. She pointed east. I listened. Luis stepped up beside him. "Where now?" he asked. Everett didn't answer immediately. He stared at the land ahead. Then he said, I'm going to find where the water hides when the desert closes its eyes. Louise frowned. That's not a place. Everett smiled, just barely. It is if you've walked long enough. They walked on. No trail, no map, just silence, and the long whisper of a land that does not forgive, but sometimes, just sometimes, allows a man to pass.